Hi guys, let's move on to Hillocks chapter 4, and I apologize for my voice. Although I write my chats weeks before, I try not to record them until closer to when we're listening to them because I want to see if there's anything we've talked about in class that might be relevant to the particular chapter. So you'll have to endure this hoarseness, which sounds worse than I think it feels. Anyway, I call this chapter, I Got Your Backing, which I think is pretty funny, but you might not. Anyway, more than anything, what I think this short chapter captures is what's awful about student papers. The ability to think through, around, above, below an issue is something that they just can't instinctively do. It must be taught. And in this chapter, Hillocks both teaches us, and we need it, what it means to make a thoughtful and intelligent judgment, and he suggests ways to teach students. Now, so far, he's walked us through arguments of fact, and that was the murder mystery chapter. And his focus there was that sort of evidence that is irrefutable. Then he moved to simple arguments of judgment in the mascot activity. And in that same chapter, we began more and more to make judgments based on criteria. You'll recall that students were judging after the mascot how good a leader the Fat Prince would be. And maybe I shouldn't call him the Fat Prince, but it's easier than voluptuary. They'd make a claim about the character of the voluptuary and then use as evidence what they saw in the painting. And then their warrant was their explanation about what the data or the evidence said about the Fat Prince's ability to be a leader. And he even introduced a little bit there the idea of backing with the notion of common knowledge. And you can review this on pages 61 and 62 of the text if it's fuzzy. I'm skipping his arguments of policy chapter, which was the chewing gum activity, because I want us to keep the Fat Prince activity in mind as we move into more complex or complicated arguments of judgment in this chapter. We make judgments all the time. We make lots of small judgments. We call something a stupid decision. We call someone a brilliant teacher. We call some dog the best dog, or in the case of Amos, the worst dog. Every little thing is, it seems, a matter of judgment. We do it so often that we sometimes forget that some judgments are pretty significant to our lives. They are actually big judgments. On page 102 of this chapter, Hillocks lists some of these big questions of judgment. When does life begin? How do we measure teacher performance? Should we ban books? And as he explains, such judgments involve difficult matters of judgment that must be questioned carefully, and if they are to become the basis for action, must be defended with appropriate warrants and backing that are sometimes quite complex. So this is where we're moving to the idea of more complex and complicated arguments and justifications. Now, I've actually been asking you to think about such questions all semester, right? These are the global essential questions that you address on your lesson plans. And as you move forward, and even as you revise some previously submitted lesson plans, think about this description of judgment as it applies to the questions that you've identified on those lesson plans as global essential questions. Accepting something as fact or truthful or reasonable is easy. Hillocks notes that we have this tendency not to think hard. And it's funny, this is what my dissertation director used to say. He said, I want you to think hard about things. And I always think that means maybe a little bit more analytically, a little bit more critically, to really challenge ideas. But the point is, it's easier to swallow whole what someone tells us, especially if we like that person, or if that person has influence over us, or if we agree with that person on other things. As a result, we don't always examine issues critically. We don't ask enough questions. We don't own our own thinking. We don't go against the grain. And these are the things we have to teach students to do. I remember the Jenna incident that he talks about in this chapter, and I think this example is really powerful. And I think there's a vital lesson in here, not just about developing definitions or about unexamined assumptions. I think there are lessons about life in here. And there's a really good article about it in the New York Times, and I'll put it under week 9 week 9 stuff. But imagine this. Imagine you create a narrative of the events from the press, just simply the Jenna incident. And you create a narrative and then you use that to begin to get students to think about unexamined assumptions and unexamined judgments. What you do is what Hillocks asks. What were the judgments involved? What were those judgments based on? In other words, what the fuck were those kids thinking when they called the tree a whites-only tree, or they hung nooses, or they ganged up on a white kid? These are such important issues. And all the time you want to look at students in your class and go, what were you thinking when you did X or Y or Z? And getting them to do that through another story models. It's that idea of imaginative rehearsal that we kind of touched on in class, and that is going to be so significant in 402 for those of you who are there next semester, or worse, that was significant for those of you who were there last semester. I love the fact that on page 103, Hillocks explicitly puts it on us. He writes, "It is mandatory for us as teachers to help students learn to examine their own judgments of those and others." Right? That is so powerful. They have to understand what makes an argument sound. They have to understand how we evaluate arguments critically and constructively. We have to give them authentic opportunities to practice those. Now, I can hear you asking, so then why, oh great and powerful Jerry, do you frown on the controversial issues through which we can cultivate those skills? Well, here's the deal. Many young people's notions about what they believe are framed by the adults in their lives. And to send a kid home to challenge his or her parents, that's a big deal. And I'm not sure you want to be the one who creates the conflict that might ensue. So instead, you find safer topics to cultivate the skills, and you suggest to students that anytime they want to assert a judgment or a belief or argue for a point or a policy, they think back to the activities that you did in your class that compelled them to think a little bit more critically about what they believe. You're giving them skills, not teaching them to think a particular way. And in the same way a lesson could be built around the Jenna incident, you could do the same thing with the Quinlan case, which is the case I grew up with. I remember that case. I remember every detail about it. I actually remember when she died. And that police chase example, to me, these are terrific ways for teaching the notion of complex definitions. The thing is, developing lessons will require you do some background work. You'll have to write something up. You'll have to create the materials. But the value of using these illustrations makes it worth it, I think. And they become something that you couldn't put into your bag of tricks and use year after year, or update if some other controversial case shows up. For example, the terrorism issue. He even talks about internment. Think about the internment of the Japanese versus what's happening in Guantanamo. Is that place in Cuba? Anyway, take a second and think about your group's This American Life. Are there clear definitions for the values you're addressing? Are there any terms that you might need to define? She wondered. I also have to say that it cracks me up that the teacher with the shitty hero assignment is from Denver, and I can't tell you how many teachers love to have students write about their hero. No definition, no criteria. And that kind of bullshit assignment leads to students who answer, oh, my hero is my parent. Oh, my hero is Justin Bieber. And not that parents aren't heroes. And not that, no, I'm sorry, Justin Bieber cannot be a hero. Let's go back to parents. Not that parents can't be heroes. But without criteria, anything goes. Right? So serious arguments of judgment demand that our responses can be defined and defended based on explicit, often complex and complicated criteria. To just say write about your hero, that's frickin' Poe with a flashlight. It's letting students have fun without any purposeful learning. And this is where warrant and backing are key, right? The warrant will connect the evidence to the claim. The backing tells us why the warrant is valid, and everything hinges on what's the criteria you have established. And those are the questions that you begin to think about. What counts as, whatever the point is? What constitutes a deadly force? What do we mean by a good leader? What do we mean by a hero? This is when we think more deeply. This is when we begin to incorporate the higher order thinking skills that it is our obligation to cultivate in students. So in case you weren't able to really parse the Quinlan case in a comfortable way, if in case you sort of looked at it and you weren't sure what the various elements are, here is the claim, data, warrant, and backing for that Quinlan case. Karen Ann Quinlan should not be removed from life support. She has no cerebral cortex function, but her autonomic nervous system is functioning. Her functioning autonomic nervous system indicates that she is not dead because, according to the Harvard Medical School, to be dead, your autonomic nervous system must test as not functioning. So the warrant is tying the evidence of the functioning autonomic nervous system to the assertion that she should not be removed off life support. But the thing is, the backing is saying, and this is why this idea of the autonomic nervous system, God, that's killing me, how it tests defines whether something is dead or not. You getting this? I know it's a little complicated and you have to think through it. That's why I think about those STEM starters. What counts as, right? What counts as dead? What constitutes being dead? What do we mean by being dead? And I did the same thing for the police chase. So the claim is that Officer Scott was justified in his actions towards Harris. He was right to use deadly force. And what's the evidence? Well, Harris was driving dangerously and at very high speeds of over 90 miles per hour. So the warrant, which ties the data to the claim, is Harris was threatening people's lives and safety. Therefore, he needed to be stopped. Apologies for not having the comma after therefore. Anyway, and the backing is the Supreme Court contends that if someone is threatening bodily harm or death, then deadly force is justified to stop him. Do you see how it's building? The Supreme Court is the support, the backing, has the back of the warrant. Get it? I love that. It has the warrant's back. Now I'm going to stop at this slide and open up a chapter 4, part 2, because I have a few slides about definition that I want to talk about. And I think I've been babbling more than I needed to, and I'm going to run out of time. So finish here, switch up, and then go to the second Hillocks chapter 4 chat. And we'll start with this teaching definition slide. Okay? Talk to you in a minute.